IDC Radio.
בינתחומי.
106.2 FM.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
IDC Radio. In collaboration with כל ישראל.
106.2 FM.
ריסק, סדר עולמי חדש, עם תומי שטיינר.
You are listening to 106.2 radio broadcasting from the Sammy Ofer School of Communications at IDC Herzliya. I welcome you to Risk, a conversation on politics, strategy and diplomacy in the 21st century. My name is Tommy Steiner. I'm with the Institute for Policy and Strategy at IDC Herzliya, and I have a pleasure, it's a real pleasure to host today Amir Oren, the Haaretz senior commentator on defense and governance affairs. Good afternoon, Amir.
Good afternoon, Tommy.
Today's show is produced by Omer Kedar. He's also our technician. The music editor is Barak Chaimovich. Mikhail Plutchak and Adi Rabinovich are in charge of the video recording and editing. You can follow us. I'll soon finish all these bylines. You can also follow us on 106.2 FM, on 106.2fm.coil, and segments of the show will be posted on 106.2 FM's YouTube channel. We have here, Amir, a prop, the diplomacy board game, some call it Risk. It's a good backdrop, I think, for our discussion on current affairs. Although it's funny, it's Europe in the 19th century, but somehow it more looks like the Middle East in the 21st century.
We may revert to the Middle East in the 7th century with the Caliphate coming back pretty soon.
Yes, true. Yes, I always say that the only difference between us and Europe in the 19th century is that they had Bismarcks and Metternichs, and I don't think we have too much of those.
And they had many Europeans and not so many Jews.
Yes, well, you said that. Let me introduce you a bit more. Amir is a senior correspondent and columnist for Haaretz, dealing with defense and governance issues, and he's a member of the newspaper's editorial board. He writes about defense, military, the government, and international relations. Amir has covered Israel's wars and diplomatic processes since the late 1960s, focusing on American-Israeli defense relationship and on NATO. And on occasion, our paths have crossed at various odd locations in that respect. He was based in Washington, D.C. for 3 years during the mid-1980s as U.S. correspondent and bureau chief. Amir is a frequent commentator on Israeli and international media outlets. He also served as a CBS news consultant and has been a guest on many international media. And he has contributed articles to The New Republic and to The Economist.
This is a good point to sign off and go to the next protest.
I'll just end by that. First of all, I think he wrote one of the most important studies on U.S.-Israel strategic relationship for the Washington Institute. He asked me to stop. I'll stop there if you don't mind. He also is a translator, by the way, something that most people don't even know. But honestly, Amir is a dean of Israeli defense commentators. He's a true defense intellectual, if that doesn't sound like an oxymoron. Serious thorough, and if I may add, he always has an original take on current affairs and always likes to add a personal twist on concerning the subjects of his writing. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, please strike the dean, because all it means is that the older guys have either died or retired, and that the dean is next in line.
Well, that wasn't my intention. But before we get into the heavy meat of our discussion today, we're going to talk about Israel's military preparedness, the strategic relationship, of course, with the United States and other countries, Iran, Syria. How can we not mention that? We're back on Risk at Radio 106.2 here at IDC Radio. My name is Tommy Steiner. I'm here with Amir Oren. Amir, let's kick off and start talking about one of the meaty issues, and that is Israel's military preparedness. Lebanon, too, would be considered by many as a low point in Israel's military preparedness, cost-led and improvement, pillar of defense is much to make of it. Do you think that we are adapting to the new security or the emerging security reality in the Middle East?
The Israeli military, the Israeli defense forces, are a very good organization. They are quite astute. They are adaptable. And from a semi-intimate look into their status, most recently, one can come out with a very positive impression. However, the question is the compatibility between the declared or at least implicit aims of the political echelon and what the military echelon is asked to do. So
Could you be more specific about this? Because
of course, if the government asks too much on too many fronts of the military without giving it the resources to do it all, then obviously you are going to have a hollow military, overextended, and when the balloon goes off, you will end up with a military only half ready to do some of the missions. It cannot do everything. It cannot have enough fighter planes to go all the way to Iran and back, and enough Iron Dome batteries to defend both its air bases and strategic infrastructure, as well as population centers, and do it in such a short period of time that so that the civilian population doesn't cry for the government to stop the war. So there is some dissonance between what the government purports to do and what it gives the military in order to do it.
Shocking. There's a dissonance there. But I have a follow-up on that. Is there anything to do with the fact that Israel does not have a national security strategy, at least not officially? There's the Meridor report that was never approved, never properly published. Only a few vague ideas were released from it, but isn't that an issue or part of the problem?
Well, Israel, as distinct from the United States, for instance, has a national identity card. If you're stopped by a police officer, you are supposed to draw your ID and show it to the officer. Yes. However, for itself, as a nation, Israel does not have an ID. Israel, it doesn't have a photo. It may have a driver's license for itself, metaphorically speaking. But Israel, for the last 45 years, has shunned away from deciding what Israel is. 45 years ago, almost to the day, then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was at the LBJ Ranch in Texas, being hosted by President Johnson. Yes. And President Johnson posed a direct question at Eshkol, this being a few months after the Six-Day War. What kind of Israel do you want? Namely, if what you need is protection for the pre-Six-Day War Israel, bolstered by guarantees, by military aid, by the militarized zones around it, by the occupied territories, which were supposed to become bargaining chips for peace and security, this is one thing. If what you aim at is annexing the territories, settling Israelis there, and then asking for the world and primarily for the United States to help you, then this is another ballgame altogether. And Israel has never
What did
come
Levi
back.
Eshkol say? What did he reply?
He was still considering as he left the ranch, and unfortunately, really unfortunately, because he was a good prime minister, he died a year later, and then Golda Meir took over, and the rest is history, including the Yom Kippur War.
Yes, indeed. But it brings me back, that story brings me back also to current days. and on a more concrete level, we are facing now a different Middle East, a changing Middle East. It's changing against our eyes. It's amazing, daunting, and puzzling. And although now with elections coming up in Israel, the Prime Minister and others are all playing up the threats and the dangers posed by this new Middle East. But if you really look at the things on the ground, the threats are not higher than they were before. They're simply different.
Definitely. This is exactly right. They are different, not necessarily more severe. And you have this board here of 19th century Europe. One can go back to the 20th century and the way the Middle East borders were drawn, the Sykes-Picot line, and all the rest post-World War I history. What we are witnessing now is a major upheaval, and it necessitates an Israeli new look at the Middle East. For the last 30, perhaps even 40 years, Israel faced quiet borders. It had de facto peace with Jordan, because Jordan was a security partner altogether. Syria was, and perhaps still is, a bitter enemy, but it was a latent one. The border in the front was quiet. And with Egypt, from 1977 on, we had a political process, and from 82 we had full peace. So Israel didn't have any real threat from its borders, except for Lebanon, where first the PLO and then Hezbollah posed a guerrilla or terror threat. Right now, all of this is evaporating because the single state actor as a neighbor is transforming itself into a hybrid one. You have a government in Syria, but you also have the rebels. The rebels themselves, of course,
are made up of a whole.
It's not even a confederation.
No, it is.
It's
a mess.
Right, it's an amalgam or whatever form it's taking of different groups, sometimes dozens of groups in the same city or district, all with various names. And Israel doesn't know whether to feel glad that the armored threat of 5 Syrian divisions poised to strike at a moment's notice. This is probably gone, not the surface-to-surface missile threat. However, the terrorist threat along the border is greater. And this is also the case on the Egyptian border, and perhaps in due course the Jordanian border will also become such a haven for terrorists, even if the Hashemite monarchy doesn't fall.
In other words, it is a nightmare for any defense planner to try and given the backdrop of our government, who doesn't know what to tell the military to do, there is a problem here about how to deal and how to address these challenges in terms of very simple, basic military planning.
Well, it's not really a nightmare because it means that they are in business, the defense planners. They can make a living throwing out all the contingency plans and drawing new ones.
We're back. You're listening to Radio IDC at 106.2. I'm Tommy Steiner. I'm joined by Amir Oren, and we're on Risk, a conversation on politics, strategy, and diplomacy. To be very polite, what do we do with the problem called Syria? Because it's a bit, we hear reports that the United States military planners are thinking about 75,000 soldiers that need to contain a possible leak of chemical warfare. Is this realistic? And how can we contend with the threats emerging from Syria today?
Well, these very news items regarding probably not 75, it's more like 50,000 American troops, but this is not the main issue, preparing to descend on Syria This is part of deterrence. This is a signal sent to the Assad regime that the United States, NATO, and Turkey are serious, and perhaps other partners around Syria, like Jordan and Israel, are serious regarding the chemical weapons threat, whether for use or for transferring to Hezbollah. But this doesn't mean that you really need so many troops. This is like a couple of divisions, plus logistics, plus air support, plus. You don't really need that. And if that were the case, then the American public would probably not be for it, for another involvement in an Arab or Muslim country so soon after leaving neighboring Iraq, and when the Afghanistan war is winding up, if it is.
If it is, yes.
So yes, it is a real threat, and Israel has always seen weapons of mass destruction as different from the conventional buildup which went on throughout the region. Israel did not take preemptive action against conventional weaponry. It did so in 1981 in Iraq, 2007 in Syria itself, when it had to do with the nuclear reactor the Syrians built with North Korean cooperation. But it is probably one actor among many who are seriously considering what to do if this scenario came to pass.
Is there an end game for Syria? A likely end game? Because, you know, we all assume one way or the other that Assad will be out of office within the near or midterm future.
You know, this is the
what
old.
comes after?
This is the old story about the terminal patient who lived to bury his doctors, those who analyzed his condition, and then he lived on and on while they passed away. Many regional leaders have already told audiences worldwide that Assad is on his way out, and these leaders are probably going to retire before he does. Defense Minister Ehud Barak may be one of them,
yes.
saying that Assad's days are numbered, the weeks are numbered, so on, and he is still there. Now, just a word about regime survival in the Arab world.
Yeah.
In 1958, General Qasem in Iraq, through the government, killed Prime Minister Nuri Said, the monarchy fell, and Qasem did it by maneuvering one armored division throughout Baghdad, taking over the presidential palace and the radio station. Beware, Tommy, the radio station at IDC is probably on the list for the next coup. And then Qasem knew that the next general could do the same to him. So he built several forces, the Republican Guard, the Presidential Guard, and then the Chemical Corps. Now, let's fast forward to Assad. Assad is going, now that he has his back to the wall, he is going to do everything to stay in power, because for him, for his family, for his entire group, the Alawites,
there's no better alternative.
It's being in power or being slaughtered. Now, the most probable scenario for Syria is being dismembered, and perhaps you're going to have an Alawite canton along the coast around Latakia, which is an Alawite stronghold. You're probably not going to see a single state, which the French built.
It might stay by name as such, but not more than that.
Now there were dreams. Yigal Allon, the late Yigal Allon, who was later foreign minister, and some people who were connected with the Mossad had these dreams in the 50s and 60s, building up a Druze mini-state in Jebel Druze. Perhaps these dreams will be revived now, and you will see a friendly canton, not so far from the Israeli border, being built too. But this very game is being played out right now.
The thing is, the only differences between I would say, the old dreams of Israelis is the fact that we have now jihadists and Islamists roving around Syria, and they're apparently also and there's also the presence of Hezbollah forces on the ground in Syria. But all in all, the thing is that it might not end with Syria in terms of its, as you call it, dismembering, because you mentioned also Sykes-Picot. Sykes-Picot is actually coming to an end. And what used to be called the Fertile Crescent, from stretching from Lebanon all the way to Iraq, is becoming a rather volatile crescent. If I assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that what happens in Syria will have an effect, an impact on what happens in Iraq and what happens in Lebanon.
Well, it sounds like the name of a play on a London stage. Yeah. Sykes and Picot are dead. And what happened in the early 20s of the 20th century was that the colonial powers came into the Middle East, the old Mesopotamia, between Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. Iraq was created only then. You had Transjordan, you had Saudi Arabia. All of these were, except for Egypt, were really built from the ground up and are now reverting to perhaps tribal or primal times. Yes, indeed, we may not see any stable regime, but that would mean that there is no center of gravity against which Israel can act. So it will have a lesser threat all around, but it will be needled by these jihadist groups that you mentioned, and Salafist and Muslim brothers and who knows what. So it will be more of a nuisance than an existential threat.
Yeah, but it can be it won't be an existential threat, but it can become a strategic nuisance, because at the end of the day, the armaments that will be roving around the Middle East will be making life very problematic. I saw Netanyahu's, I don't know if you saw the election ads or commercials, and he is promising to cover Israel with iron domes. I don't know if you saw that. I'm not sure that is an answer to. It's like somebody holding holding a hammer in his hand and thinking that, any solution can be solved with a hammer.
Well, this is a very, very empty promise, because if one were to cover Israel with iron domes, then one wouldn't have the money for F-35s, not to mention for welfare and other domestic
and education,
purposes.
Yes, of course. No.
And also, you don't win wars by defense, by going on the defense, including active defense. It's good to have all of those Iron Dome batteries, again, first of all, to give cover to the air bases in order for the fighter planes to be able to attack the missile launchers. Next, for power stations and other infrastructure installations, and only as a third priority, civilian population centers.
But that's the reason why you won't go into politics, I guess.
Perhaps.
But coming back to this point, and picking up on it, we're facing a lot nameless enemies, in a sense. We are going to be surrounded, actually, probably by non-governed regions, from Sinai, or perhaps, hopefully not through Jordan, up on top to Syria and on to Lebanon. This mandates, or at least requires, some rethinking of Israel's force structure. I don't think we will need that many tanks, do we? Fighters perhaps, but tanks?
You don't need so many tanks, but just throwing several hundred tanks of your current arsenal into the dustbin won't save you much.
No.
The question is, are you going to renew your tank fleet and pay a lot of money for new tanks? So right now, you don't need so many tanks. Military organizations don't like to leap into the unknown future without having a foot on the ground with what is called legacy weaponry. So yes, they know that they are better off investing in other stuff, but they don't really want to get rid of what they have right now until the new technology is turned into new weapons. But you listed several threats. We can add more. For instance, Saudi Arabia, people tend to forget it, but Saudi Arabia virtually borders Eilat. The Saudi Arabian border with Jordan is only a few miles from Aqaba, which is, of course, bordering Eilat, where Salafist groups or others to take over Saudi Arabia, or if they only took over the western provinces of Saudi Arabia and set up shop there, launching rockets at Eilat, Israel would be hard-pressed to do something, anything, because what would it do? Strike at Mecca, strike at Riyadh, at Jeddah, go into the Arabian desert to hunt?
To hunt the Salafists, yes. No, the scenario of the fall of the House of Saud and of, I would say it, the less effective nature of the Saudi government is not, regretfully, a far-fetched scenario. We're back on Risk. Radio, IDC Radio 106.2. I'm Tommy Steiner. I'm joined by Amir Oren. We talked about Syria. We talked about the threats posed by Syria and from our neighboring countries. Let's take a further distant view to what is considered perhaps Israel's existential threat, Iran. Is it an existential threat?
It potentially is. It could become an existential threat to Israel if it had nuclear weapons and if its regime would still be hostile, intent on the destruction of Israel. It may not live up to its promises or let Israel die rather than live. However, being a revolutionary Islamist regime, Israel could not take the chance of having such an opponent, a regional opponent with its nuclear threat hovering over it. So Israel will probably not be content with containment.
Are we therefore closer to a Israeli-Iranian showdown?
This question has been posed for the last 3 or 4 years, annually or perhaps even weekly, and each time Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Barak, and others have come up with indications or even outright expressions that this 2010 is the year of decision, this 2011 is finally the year of decision, and this 2012 is ultimately the year of decision.
And we're now in 2013.
And yes, lo and behold, all of these years have come and gone. The Iranians are closer to the ability to produce nuclear weapons if they so decide, but they are not there yet. And this coming year is probably going to be a bit more crucial, first of all, because we may see a clash between the Obama administration and the Netanyahu administration. We'll go a bit deeper into that in a moment. We're going to have elections in Iran in June, and we are going to see what direction the Iranian regime takes after that. It has hedged its bets recently. It has not gone as fast as it could on the nuclear route. So there are indications that perhaps we are seeing the making of some Western or American dialogue with Iran, and Israel is right now on the sidelines. It is difficult to envision an Israeli unilateral operation against Iran, against the express wishes of President Obama.
All right, that's an interesting prediction. But I agree with you that the Iranians are seeming to slow down, even though there are mixed reports on how slow they are slowing down. But they appear minded not to cross a certain threshold. In a nutshell, are you? But I'll ask the question otherwise. There still is a controversy over the appointment of Chuck Hagel as the next U.S. Secretary of Defense. But one of the reports, one of the issues that were raised in that context is his appointment the wrong message sent to Iran?
Well, let's talk about the Israeli leadership in a moment as a mirror image for what you asked. In Israel, there are no doves on Iran. There are only hawks. Some of them are reluctant doves, reluctant hawks,
yes.
Willing, posing as doves, reluctant hawks, willing to see what transpires and seeing the military operation against Iran as a last resort. But even those who are being portrayed as anti-war with Iran are actually willing to consider such a contingency once they are convinced that it is absolutely necessary. On the American side, you have, first of all, the president, and policy is presidential. Of course, it needs approval in Congress. It needs approval in public opinion, and the president must have cabinet officers willing and able to execute his policy. But President Obama knows what he is about to do in Iran, and Chuck Hagel is not going to block anything the president is going to do. Now, the President George W. Bush, having fired Don Rumsfeld, appointed Robert Gates, who was a member of the Iraq Study Group in late 2006. This was considered a signal because Gates was against Rumsfeld's policy. However, what later transpired was that the recommendations of General David Petraeus regarding the so-called surge were accepted by Bush, even though Gates was supposedly against this line of thinking before he was appointed. So one should consider the Hagel appointment in American terms, in domestic American terms, budget cuts, and of course, this is a signal that the next defense secretary, if he is confirmed by the Senate, is going to be very reluctant to get America into another war in the Middle East. But that would also,
in general, it seems.
Yes, but and the American defense strategy is now on a quote-unquote pivot from the Middle East to the Far East, but nevertheless, there are no other spots around the world where America is supposed to get into trouble. But if Hagel is convinced, if the case is made, and Hagel, along with the next Secretary of State John Kerry and others, are convinced that war as a last resort is absolutely necessary, then the American public is probably also going to be convinced that this is not a make-up case, that this is really a necessity to which the president and his cabinet and others have come to the conclusion that it is a must-do.
I agree with your analysis, but my question is slightly different. First of all, I agree. At the end of the day, it's the president who calls the shot, and this president on foreign affairs and national security is an opinionated president. This is not, I don't want to mention other presidents from the history of the United States, or for that matter, prime ministers of Israel. But my question was slightly different. What kind of message is received in the Middle East, in Iran, when President Obama appoints a Chuck Hagel? And let me give another spin to it. What does the U.S. administration need to do now to correct that slight possible misinterpretation or misunderstanding?
This is not necessarily a misinterpretation. One has to start this analysis with the personality of Barack Hussein Obama. President Obama came into office with the ambition of being a great president, not just a president, not just a run-of-the-mill president, but a great president. his vision is for at least a less nuclear world, if not zero nuclear, at least lessening the nuclear threat, lessening proliferation. That means that he may also lean on Israel to come out with a new nuclear policy, perhaps more transparency, perhaps putting its cards on the table in order for Iran not to become an overt nuclear power. So we may see another game altogether. We are far from the end game. And this is true also because everybody agrees that even an Israeli operation against Iran will only delay the Iranian nuclear program for a year or two. So the Hagel appointment, yes, it means that if pro-Israeli groups in the United States came out against it and the president agreed to go ahead and do it, that means that the president is not afraid to clash with the so-called Israeli lobby. But this also happened with President Reagan and the AWACS debate 32 years ago, and Reagan was considered pro-Israel, but had America's interests at heart because it is America first, and Israel, for all its importance to Washington, is secondary.
Oh, that's rather high, actually. We'll take a break here, and then we can talk more about the strategic relationship with the United States and other countries. We're back on Risk at IDC Radio 106.2. I'm Tommy Steiner. I'm pleased to be joined by Amir Oren. Amir, well, let's talk about something that you've been following, I think, for more years than you perhaps would wish to remember, the U.S.-Israel strategic relationship. And I've been following this also for less years, I agree, but I concede, but there is a sense that the view in the United States is changing when it comes to Israel. There is a sense that Israel is less than a strategic asset. It's becoming a strategic liability, to be very, very blunt about it. Is the Chuck Hagel nomination the final nail in the coffin in that respect?
Well, you know, this strategic asset versus strategic liability debate has been going on for many years.
True.
Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General George Brown, came out with this proposition almost 40 years ago and suffered for it during the Ford administration. America is being changed against our very eyes. It has transformed. This is not the waspish America. This is not even the Anglo-Saxon majority plus Jews that we all used to see. There are now more Latinos, more blacks in power, including, of course, at the White House itself. And Israel's position has also changed. It is no longer David, it is considered Goliath. Whether it's true or not is immaterial. The fact is, Israel is considered self-serving in its policies, and the fact that the United States has been drawn into Middle East wars, even when it didn't have anything or a lot to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict, weighs against Israel. In testimonies on Capitol Hill, many diplomats and military officers speaking for the United States have constantly said that Israel should do its share in order to solve the Palestinian problem so that the United States will not be seen as Israel's protector. And Israel has dragged its feet for many years. Its policies vis-à-vis the Palestinians are perceived as negative, again, regardless of the truth of the matter and of the details of diplomacy. Sure. So if you combine all of that with the impression that Israel tries to dictate to not only the United States in general, as a general notion, but to the President of the United States, this has caused negative feelings, and perhaps Obama is now coming back at his tormentors, at Prime Minister Netanyahu, who, as Rahm Emanuel, Obama's confidant, said, failed in betting on the wrong horse on George Romney. And Obama is not anti-Israel. He may be anti-Netanyahu, but these phrases are not identical.
No, but he's not pro-Israel either. I'm not sure if he's pro-Israel. I don't think that Chuck Hagel or Obama, for that matter, have a sentimental relationship to Israel.
Well, this is a philosophical discussion. Is Netanyahu pro-Israel? Not only is Obama pro-Israel. Now, one does not have to go back as far as former Undersecretary of State George Bull, who offered to save Israel in spite of itself. In each capital, people presume to understand the other country's interests better than
their own, yes.
But it is. But there is a sizable minority of Israelis whose views are not that different from Obama's or Hagel's. So one should be careful before labeling Obama or Hagel as anti-Israeli. Only this week, former Navy Commander-in-Chief, retired Rear Admiral Zev
Almog brought that report, yes.
It appeared in the Atlantic monthly website, but Almog himself has drawn the attention of correspondents to the fact that he personally and nationally, if one may say, is friendly with Hagel, and that Hagel has never uttered any anti-Israeli remark to the contrary. So Israel should not be drawn into battle because some Jewish American organizations presume to understand Israel's interests better than the Israeli government and public.
Picking up from that, there is, I would add, however, that there is a sense that within the Democratic Party, particularly within the grassroots or the intellectual grassroots of the Democratic Party, they're coming to adopt a more, I would say, European perspective on the Middle East and Israel than ever before. And although I agree with you that that doesn't mean that they're necessarily anti-Israeli, but their view on the conflict, and on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, let's be more precise, is somewhat different because their belief is, and that's where it comes from, that if only you would solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, everything else would fall into place. And if you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you said it's somewhat immaterial what really happens. But if you look at the conflict, or at least over the past 5, 6, 7 years, and I don't like to use the term blame, but there's plenty of that to go around. And can you understand politically and rationally the motivations of Netanyahu vis-a-vis the peace process over the past few years? To an extent, yes. Would you have recommended something else to do? Perhaps. But if you look at the process, there is an uneven, or I would say unbalanced approach towards Israel, at least among the European political policy community, and within the Democratic Party.
The Clinton administration in the 90s was pro-Israel as long as Rabin and Peres were in power, and as long as Netanyahu, who succeeded Peres, went along, including in Hebron and the Y Plantation Conference. Now, President Bush went along with Sharon as long as Sharon was reasonable, including in 2002 in this two-state solution, which Bush was the first to pronounce, and Sharon reluctantly adopted too, and then, of course, in the disengagement from Gaza. When Olmert was in power, he joined Bush in the Annapolis process. Came Netanyahu and unilaterally broke this process and then called on Abu Mazen to return to the table. There was no need to get off the table in order to then pay a price for coming back to the table. Now, this is not as simplistic. The way you portrayed the Democratic Party may be true if you're talking about the ignorant masses, if there are any. But the fact of the matter is that the policy is much more nuanced. As long as Israel signals its readiness to compromise, even though the other side may not meet it halfway, then the American body politic understands this policy. But if Israel is seen as always hardline, as building more and more settlements in order for compromise to become impossible, then yes, you are right. American policy, regardless of the party in power, becomes more like the European policy towards Israel, which means that Israel is isolating itself in the global arena.
Our time is coming up. I would have asked you about NATO, but I don't think that...
Not this year.
No, it's
not as long as Turkey and Israel are at each other's throats.
I think they're loosening the grip. That's my impression, but I might be wrong.
Well, and now that Lieberman is out of power, and now that Netanyahu may be more amenable to find some formula whereby he would apologize to Erdogan
without apologizing.
Yes, then it is possible.
Oh, it is. Amir, I want to thank you for taking the time and coming out to Herzliya and joining us here at IDC Radio. I have to thank a lot of people. I want to thank Omer Kedar, the show producer and our technician today. I want to thank our music editor, Barak Khaimovich, our video technicians, Michael Pluchak and Adi Rabinovich. Please follow us on 106.2 FM or on the internet on 106.2fm.co.il. And don't forget to see us on our YouTube channel, on the IDC Radio's YouTube channel at 106.2 FM. See you soon. Thank you very much.
הרדיו הבינתחומי.
בינתחומי.